Greetings, this is Chris Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review. You can see this is the first issue of a separate magazine series. That is to say, this isn't Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, and it isn't the same thing taking on a different title for a while. It was a separate parallel series of magazines that went on for a short period of time. As you can see, this is the very first issue, and to introduce that issue, he wrote a story for it. It just says his name here. And inside, no blurb, just that there it is, page 56, Fair Exchange by Isaac Asimov. That's all there is in the table of contents. Now we go to page 56. Yeah, alright. It's got a nice big picture on it. Look at that. Got all these people respectable looking people from 1871, like sitting in there watching a play or a movie, or, well, they didn't have movies in 1871, but a theatrical presentation or musical. And here's somebody throwing papers away like he didn't care. Here's some hands. And sort of scenes from the different stories. It says Fair Exchange ? By Isaac Asimov, illustrated by Freft. On Gilbert Sullivan and time travel and an exchange. Was it worth it? So we have somebody who's got this particular kind of time travel developed. You don't actually go back to some other time, but they find some mind that resonates very, very, very closely with yours somewhere in the past, because you have such very similar patterns of thought and so forth. And it turns out that a gigantic fan of Gilbert and Sullivan happens to have the same mindset as some obscure stockbroker living in 1871 in London. And this is about the first collaborative effort of the two writers, Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert would come up with the lyrics, and Sullivan would come up with the music. They are, of course, very famous for such musical operas, light operas, as The Pirates of Penzance, the HMS Pinafore, and so forth. Well, those are probably some of the very, very biggest hits, but there's a lot of other ones. And to some degree, they're all classics, some more than others, but at any rate, they're all pretty well known. The very first effort together, however, was called Thespis. As it stands, Thespis was not held on to. I guess they didn't think it was worth holding on, despite having in fact shown in the theater for, I don't know, 60-something performances. But I guess that wasn't deemed very good business, so they let it go. It was an early effort, but it was the first collaborative effort of the two, and apparently it was all in all surprisingly successful, though nowhere near up to the level of the success of the later plays. Well, little of it exists. A small section of it was lifted and copied almost directly into, of all things, The Pirates of Penzance, and I guess it blended them very nicely. A few other bits and pieces are known, but the whole thing as a whole performance doesn't exist. It's one of the great lost works, and there it is. Suppose you could be transported back to that time in London of 1871 when the play was being performed. You could just go and see it, hear all the songs, the music, everything. And there it all is, the lost work right in front of you. This is what he wanted to do. He was hoping that he could be in the mind of somebody, and that's all. He doesn't go back physically, his body stays in the present. They just find some way to amplify his mind or something in some way that it kind of ties in with another mind of another time. And I don't know how you actually find that, because he was a big Gilbert and Sullivan fan. In 1871, yes, you may have had people who are listening to their music, watching their performances and so forth, and following the hilarious words and so on and so forth that make all these things so enjoyable. But they're not fans of collaboration that at that point with the Thespis was experiencing its first, and so far as anyone knew and expected, only collaboration that would ever exist. Somebody else who brought the two people together. They said, Gilbert, write some lyrics. He does, and they gave it to some guy named Sullivan. Sullivan put some music to these words. Sullivan did, and they had a thing called Thespis, which wasn't even deemed worth saving. So, and they didn't collaborate again for several years. But at some point, they came together again through other circumstances. And this time, they started doing some collaborations. They still each did stuff on their own with other people. But there was just something that came together. Sort of like when the Beatles are together, they did something really phenomenal. Each Beatle separately could do some interesting stuff, but it was just never the same having one or another Beatle, or even a couple of them, performing together, or better still, writing brand new songs together and performing them with all four of them, the original Beatles. Well, the main ones. I mean, I'm talking the really early originals. Even leave out Pete Best and, what was that other guy's name? John brought him in. He couldn't even play a bass guitar handed to him. But anyway, no, I'm just talking your standard John, Paul, George, and Ringo. You put the four of those guys together, and there was a synergy among them that was far more than anything each of them individually could do. And Gilbert and Sullivan kind of were that way. You put the two together, and they would just make these awesome light opera, humorous, musical play sort of thing. And although each tried to do other collaborations with other people, none of those are much remembered. I don't even know how much of that stuff even exists anymore, even as Thespis is, for the most part, lost. At any rate, he goes back. He becomes joined with this other mind of somebody, the stockbroker, who wants it so bad it isn't hard to even motivate him. He's practically ready to do it anyway, but just that little bit of a nudge was enough to put him over the edge and make him actually attempt to steal a copy. The idea being, well, he doesn't steal a copy, but through circumstances otherwise covered in here, it does the circumstances otherwise covered, it does manage to be recovered. He actually did, in effect, kind of change history just a tiny amount, such that whoever invented the time travel didn't actually do it. The same people, he's the same person. He'd known the other person. They had talked about things like, oh, if only we can do time travel this way, blah blah. But it was just a couple of guys talking about it, whereas originally the guy had done and built it. And then our character goes back in time. The other one is this in a slightly different times, changed time. There is a tragic loss. He gains the whole Thespis, but he loses somebody that was very dear to him. I'll just leave it at that. And that's why they call it fair exchange. Was that a fair exchange? And it's a question mark at the end. And that's pretty much the story. It's kind of fun. It was included in here in the very first issue of his SF Adventure magazine, and it would be collected into his Winds of Change collection of short stories. And let's see here. It had a little introduction to it here. There's a little introduction to it in the Winds of Change. Let's just cover that, and I think that'll be it. Okay, it says, I'm a member of the Gilbert and Sullivan Society of New York, a most enthusiastic one, and never miss a meeting if I can help it. Once, when I was in the apartment of one of the members, rehearsing something we were going to do at one of the meetings, the play Thespis was mentioned. It was the first of the Gilbert and Sullivan collaborations, and almost all the music to it is lost. And once, I got the thought of weaving the matter into a science fiction story. I got to work on it in January 1978, to the delight of the Society generally. There was only one catch. I intended to write a funny story, but as every writer knows, stories have a bad habit of writing themselves, and you will have to accept the result, the story that seemed to want. It appeared in the fall 1979 issue of Asimov's Science Fiction Adventure magazine, or AFSAM, a short-lived, alas, sister magazine of Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction magazine. Fair Exchange also appeared in 1981 in a small three-story collection of mine called Three by Asimov. This was published by William Targ in a very limited edition of 250 at $60 a copy. Presumably they are now all gone, so I see nothing wrong with including it in a collection that will be considerably larger, cheaper, and more available than this one. So, one of the other two stories in Three by Asimov also appears in this collection, by the way. I'll point it out as he gets to it. Well, anyway. That's basically what there is of the story. And he has at times other stories made references to the Gilbert and Sullivan. They were pretty big. Okay. Well, thank you for listening.